Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. And on this week's episode, we have a return guest. We have Lincoln A. Mitchell, and he's going to be talking about his new book out from University of Nevada Press, 3 Years Our Mayor, George Moscone, and the Making of Modern San Francisco. Lincoln, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me back. My name is Lincoln Mitchell. I am a writer and a professor, and I teach in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University.
This one is not necessarily related to the Four Corners, but having had you on the show before, I was interested to read it and have you back to talk. So tell us a little bit about 3 Years Our Mayor.
Well, this book is really two things interwoven. One is it's a biography of George Moscone, who is an enormously important figure in the history of the city of San Francisco and the state of California, and who is largely, to the extent he's remembered by anyone outside of a few older San Franciscans, he's the other guy who was assassinated with Harvey Milk on November 27th, 1978. It's an attempt to talk about him and his both important but also kind of cinematic San Francisco life, and then through that to really probe the political history of San Francisco in the middle half of the 20th century to try to see if that helps us get some idea to understand the city of today.
Well, and you really have so much information. It's very comprehensive. But first, what got you interested in writing about this topic?
Well, I've been interested in the politics and history of San Francisco for a long time, partially because of the experience of having grown up here, and then as an adult, moved back to New York where I was born. And for the next 30-odd years, just having people so badly misunderstand the city. And one of the reasons is the media portrays it, as half the time as this crazy lefty place, and then half the time as taken over by tech. But there's not a lot of serious research and scholarship about San Francisco, particularly books that are broadly accessible like this one is. I was interested in that project. And then George Moscone, when I wrote my 2019 book, San Francisco Year Zero, I became aware of just how important he was and how nobody really knows anything about him. And then as I began to do research more, frankly, I found, similarities. We grew up in the same neighborhood. I mean, George Moscone is my father's age, but to walk from George Moscone's house to my house, where we both grew up, our childhood homes, it's a 10-minute bus ride or about a 20-minute walk. We both were raised by single mothers. We both went to Catholic school. He had a different take on that because he was Catholic and I'm Jewish, so it was a little different experience for me. He grew up playing basketball in every corner of the city. I grew up playing baseball in every corner of the city. So when you write a biography, especially of a relatively modern person, someone whose life overlapped with yours, you almost create a bond. And I kind of felt that bond, which was frankly a bit of a challenge because this is not a hagiography. George Moscone was a complicated guy, and he was not a great success at everything he did. And he had flaws like the rest of us, some of them more pronounced. So I tried to go into that as well.
It is such an interesting city. I've only been there, I think, twice. Once when I was little and I don't remember very well, and once as an adult. But it's a really fascinating city. And to me, like coming in as just someone who's got very little knowledge, just been there a few times, and so many questions from visiting. How did this city develop as it did, and how has it become what it is now? Because, when I went there as an adult, I'm bringing in my ideas from how the media portrays it and the little bit I know here and there and baseball-related facts and knowledge.
Right.
And so I enjoyed the visit, but I didn't really understand the city very well and its history. It just seemed like a really complicated place. And in reading 3 Years Our Mayor, it is a really complicated place.
Yes. The thing about San Francisco, I would make a couple of things. The key to San Francisco, and this was key to George Moscone's 1975 campaign for mayor, if you could sum up in one word, is neighborhoods. This is a city of very distinct neighborhoods. There are some parts of the city where you walk 5 blocks and it's not only feels like a very different neighborhood, the housing stock is different, the architecture is different, and even the weather is different. Because of the hills and the being on peninsula, we have microclimates here. So that a little thing like taking the bus from the outer Richmond to downtown for a meeting, you get there and you can tell who comes from the western third of the city because they're wearing more clothing because they got on the bus and it was cold. And it's a city where throughout much of Moscone's life, it was still a city not that much smaller than it is today. San Francisco was 750,000 people in 1950, and at the turn of the century, it finally got past that number again in the year 2000. But it was a city where you were defined, if you were from here, and even now, by where you went to high school, because the neighborhood identities are so intense. And the kind of anthropology of the city, which is really only understood by insiders. And then it's a city where it has this kind of, I think, dual identity, where it presents to the world as this very lefty city, primarily because of what we might call liberal social policy. This was really one of the birthplaces of the LGBT movement and revolution, right? It was a hotbed of anti-war activism. It was all kinds of civil rights activism, but governed very conservatively. This is a city, to put it in, we're talking about a former mayor, but the current mayor of San Francisco is a billionaire whose family fortune originated in the gold rush. That's 180 years ago. And the key endorsement he got was from a newspaper that's been around since the gold rush. And for most of that time, and if you read some of the editorials that I quote in this book, you get that sense, really supporting the interest of moneyed San Francisco. And then the other thing about San Francisco is that it's simultaneously a big city and a small town, always. And that's a really challenging place. It's a really challenging place to understand, to describe to the rest of the world, but it's also what makes it both so fascinating and frankly so important.
Well, that was something that I was struck by while reading, is there is this duality to it, like you said, of this really conservative history on one side, and so much of that still seems to affect the politics in the city and its development. But people who are not familiar with the city, who don't necessarily know its history, we're coming in, looking at it as this more progressive, liberal, tech-centered place. And there's still this really complex balance, if it achieves a balance. Sometimes probably yes, sometimes probably not. Of these histories and the modernization that's really shaped it over time.
And if you're talking about today's city, remember, the tech influence is the engine of the conservative politics today. A lot of the same tech billionaires you're seeing around Donald Trump today were, trying to do that in San Francisco a year or two ago, and with some success. Both of those things can be true at the same time, but in the public eye, it's only. And part of that is because when you physically get to this city, it feels different than other places. For example, it's a small thing, but the striking natural beauty of San Francisco, if you're walking around Detroit or New York and you see a broken window from a car being broken into, or a needle on the street, or a homeless person, doing something they really should be doing in private, not in public, it strikes you. But in San Francisco, you're thinking, I turn away from that and I'm looking at, the fog rolling in over the Golden Gate Bridge. And that beauty almost throws people. And then if you're coming from many other parts of the United States, particularly in the period that really kind of is central to this book, beginning around, say, 1967 through the end of the century, you saw a level, for example, just a gay presence in the city that led a lot of people to make other assumptions about the city. So we have this, even conservative San Francisco takes pleasure in kind of the goofy side of San Francisco. But that's not the same as meaningfully progressive politics. And that's both the confusing point, but that's also, to get back to the book, that's what George Moscone was trying to do as mayor, was to bring a kind of economically progressive politics, to rein in the power of the downtown business interests, which are now even more powerful because they're global tech interests, global businesses with much more money. And it was a great challenge for him to do that.
Yeah, I found that to be very interesting. I don't follow politics as well as I should, although lately a little bit more, because I think you have to figure out what the heck's going on. But it was really interesting reading, especially the early part of the book, and seeing how just different he was and the group that he was involved with, and really kind of the battles that they were up against, in seeing a vision for San Francisco and for what it should do and be moving forward. And there was still really a lot of staunch belief that, no, we need to just keep doing what we're doing, stay the course. And he was really one of those voices that was pushing to say there's other options and we need to make some changes. And you really bring in a lot of the factors that contribute to that, and a lot of the players and the history and everything that goes into where the city was at that point of which way are we going to go? And then the voices. And this had to be just, I'm imagining, like a crazy amount of research for you to put all of these pieces together.
It was a lot of research, and also a lot of things about which I knew a little bit and needed to know a lot more. I just would add, by way of background, because I'm assuming many of your listeners aren't deeply familiar with either George Moscone's life or the history of San Francisco. He was born in 1929. For a little bit, he got elected to the Board of Supervisors, which is the equivalent of the City Council here, in 1963, to the State Senate in 66, and in 67 became the Democratic leader of the State Senate, and then was elected mayor in 1975. So that then was assassinated in 1978. So we're talking about, in public office, a 15-year period where the San Francisco, of the day George Moscone was sworn in and the day he was assassinated has changed as much as any major city in 15 years, really, in the history of the United States. I mean, just except for the early days, say in the 20th century, just extraordinary changes. And to just highlight a couple of examples, in the 50s and 60s, even when he's on the board of supervisors that is funded by, the Chamber of Commerce, all the big businesses, the mayor and the governor, to build a network of freeways throughout the city that would have essentially turned the city unrecognizable from what it is today, and would have really destroyed neighborhoods and destroyed cities. And that is the first kind of neighborhood-based movement. It wasn't even a left-right movement, because very conservative neighborhoods, wealthy neighborhoods, lower-income neighborhoods, various racial backgrounds were all against these freeways. And it was the first time that the neighborhoods rose up to push back against the power that the financial interests downtown were trying to project. And that really begins to redefine the city. And then when Moscone runs for mayor in 1975, in the midst of a year where, as majority leader of the state Senate, he pushed through legislation decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana possession, decriminalizing consensual sexual relations between two people of the same gender, and making acupuncture legal. Acupuncture was illegal in the state of California due to racist laws going back to the 19th century. He does all that, but if you think of those three laws, it gives you a pretty good framework for thinking about progressive politics for the next quarter century. Notably, no economic reforms there, because that was the struggle always. And all of that is met with extraordinary opposition. And when he ran for mayor in 1975, in the runoff, his opponent was somebody, John Barbagelata, who ideologically and politically could have been Frank Rizzo or Rudy Giuliani, the candidate of angry urban backlash. Enough with the civil rights, enough with the gay people, let's make sure the cops are all white, anti-union, all of those things. And the race was decided by about 2% of the vote. So it was a very, very deeply divided and contested city during that period.
And I imagine trying to figure out how to speak to both sides of that was extremely challenging. But you describe him as someone who was really active within the community and who was seen as someone who understood what people in the city wanted, and not just. It's different today because we have, social media and we have all of these other ways of reaching out to people when you're trying to make a name for yourself or connect. And all of that didn't exist back then. But he seemed to be exceptionally good at making those in-person connections to build that rapport with people and be someone that the community in small sections like the neighborhoods, as well as in the larger context, seemed to trust in a way that for being someone fairly new to the political scene in the grand scheme of everything going on, it's really impressive that he was able to garner that support and build that rapport with people.
I would stress that he wasn't really new. Everyone has to run the first time. But by the time he's run for mayor, he's been elected citywide 4 times already, because elections for supervisor were citywide. And the first time he ran, of course, he was new. But it's important to also think about what George Moscone won. He was just a very naturally good campaigner. People liked him. He was a charismatic, good-looking guy. You could see that in some of the photos in the book. But in addition to that, he could speak to both, if you will, old and new San Francisco. So his name first begins appearing in local papers in the late 1940s. He doesn't first seek office until 1960 when he loses, and then 63 when he wins, because he's a basketball star. He's an all-city basketball player at St. Ignatius High School, college preparatory school, which, if you understand kind of the sociology of San Francisco, St. Ignatius, or SI as it's almost universally known, is the kind of elite Catholic school. So if you're Italian and you end up at SI, you have access to and ties with the leading Catholic families in San Francisco. So he was a candidate who could both talk to old San Francisco as an Italian-American, educated in the Catholic schools, sports star, family man after a fashion, and the new San Francisco, because he could relate to the younger, hipper people, as it were. There's a wonderful letter that I quote when Bill Graham, the kind of legendary rock and roll promoter who worked on a concert with George Moscone, either 74 or 75, to raise money for after-school activities for kids, sends him a letter and says, I want you to hire this guy as the liaison to the young, hip community. And it's very hard to imagine any other mayor or even candidate for mayor during that period here in San Francisco being in communication with Bill Graham. But it's even harder to think of someone who could both be in communication with Bill Graham and go to, the Catholic neighborhoods in the Sunset District and talk about high school basketball. And that was a real political skill that he had.
Well, and you talk a lot about how he developed into a person who could do that. And you touched on a little bit earlier about the neighborhoods and the importance of the identity of the neighborhoods and how they make up the city. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the influences in his life that made him someone who kind of had a different viewpoint from other white men of that time period in his social class, to have these different perspectives that some people did share, but a lot of others at that time, it seems, were not seeing things quite the same way, not wanting things to go in the same direction. He really seems to have had an upbringing and early in his adult life that really shaped his worldview of who he was and who he wanted to be within the larger community of San Francisco. Because he wanted to be there and stay there and help and grow the city in a direction that to him was important and the social issues that he really focused on. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how you researched that and brought together all of those influences to make him the person that he was.
Right. A central question of the book is exactly what you said. How does this Italian-American guy, born in 1929, into a generation where by the time the 60s and 70s roll around, most of those people are conservative? He goes to the right high school, a few years later ends up graduating from college and then a top law school. He had a career as a successful, affluent attorney lined up for him, and he never pursued that, never really made any money, even when he was briefly in private practice. How did he end up where he ended up, on the progressive side of the political spectrum? I don't think there's an easy answer to that, and to some extent, I leave that to the reader, but there are some clues. So, for example, one of the things that people most misunderstand about San Francisco is historically just how Catholic a city this was. At one point, I think there was one church for every 2,500 people, which is an enormous proportion of churches. It's a very Catholic city, and there was a Catholic involvement in progressive politics. So, he went to Catholic school from, pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. So there may have been, a Catholic history teacher or the right Jesuit at St. Ignatius who really kind of got him thinking about things differently. He came from a very modest background, was raised by a single mother at a time when that might have been more stigmatized than it was, when I was growing up or today or something. So I think he didn't see himself as, one of the rich kids. I'm not saying he had a chip on his shoulder because he was a sports star and had the charisma and the women loved him. So he didn't have that kind of insecurity about him, but I think it may have led him to see things differently. And then, San Francisco was not just a strong labor town, but a city with real radical labor politics going on at the time. The general strike of 1934, which ends in violent police attack on the strikers. Moscone was, 4 or 5 years old when that happened. So it's not like he remembered it, but it was in the air around him, so he would have known longshoremen. That was the union that was behind the general strike. He would have known longshoremen back in the neighborhood where he lived who were involved with that. So there was a radical politics in the air. What I do know is that by the time he got to law school, now we're talking the mid-1950s, more or less, early to mid-1950s, he went to law school at Hastings, which is now the UC College of Law in San Francisco. And he didn't have any money. He never had any money as a younger person. And he got a job as a custodian, sweeping up the floors and stuff. And one of the other custodians there was Willie Brown, who, of course, became a Speaker of the California Assembly, mayor, longtime power broker here in San Francisco. And Willie Brown is African-American. And Willie Brown told me, he said, I never met a guy who at such a young age, a white guy of that generation, understood civil rights and understood what African Americans were experiencing and was so unequivocally on our side. So there is reason to believe that he had those views from a relatively And a lot of the people I spoke to who knew him and had thoughts about this, and I asked them, and they all said, well, you know, he played basketball in every neighborhood. He went to the Western Addition and played basketball against African Americans and to the Mission, which wasn't, you know, against Mexicans and Chinatown and this neighborhood and, you know, Greeks and Irish and Jews and all this. And there's some truth to that, but I grew up playing baseball in every corner of this city. And I frankly grew up a lot of racist guys who, if they went to an African American neighborhood, came away with more racism. So that doesn't explain it either. But there was something, you know, just unusual that drove him to that. And I think you have to read the book and come to your own conclusion about that.
Well, and you give lots of information to help the reader do that, because it is a really fascinating, complex process. And it's interesting because it made me, while I was reading this, we're wrapping up the semester, we're recording this mid-May. My students had been working on their final projects. We did To Kill a Mockingbird this year, and their written reflection was to relate some of the story's themes to modern day. And I told them these can be personal experiences or these can be things in the news. And where we live in San Juan County, There's definitely issues with racism here and plenty of other things related to the books. And it was really interesting to see the number of students who didn't think that racism really existed anymore in the world and their little bubble that they live in. And they had a harder time relating the story to modern life because they didn't have that exposure to these issues and other people's experiences. And it made me think of that in that section where you're talking about him growing up playing in different areas of the city and interacting with other people and being in situations where he's exposed to a lot more than maybe some of the other people he went to school with, where kind of had very similar experiences. And like you said, of course, that doesn't explain everything, but I think that exposure just to other people's life experiences and to talk to them and to hear how things personally affect them, that really leaves an impression, even if it's not something you faced personally, when you hear those stories that actually explain, the feelings, the emotions, the long-term impacts on someone. It really sticks with you. And if you're someone who is an empathetic person, that can really shape your way of viewing the world. And I had wondered that about George Moscone, if he was kind of that empathetic person that genuinely listened and took in what people told him and shared those experiences to the point that the social issues that he championed genuinely seemed to mean a lot to him. They weren't just talking points. And you don't always see that today.
That's right. I mean, this is a guy who marched with the farm workers, right? And here in California, he went to register voters in Mississippi, back when not a lot of white attorneys from California were doing that in 1964. But I think you raise some really interesting points, right? One of them is that in the 1940s and 50s, there were a lot of white Americans who didn't think that racism was a problem anymore. So that's almost the default setting for many white Americans. So it's not unusual your students don't feel that, but it's also how many white San Franciscans felt, especially in a city that was much, much whiter. San Francisco, as late as 1960, was 90% non-Hispanic white. So it was a very, very white population. But my sense is also that people, what they go out of these situations with really has a lot to do with what they bring into. So if you go into that African-American neighborhood as a racist, you're going to come out more racist. And if you go in with a little bit of awareness of how people's lives are different and how people face different challenges, you're going to see that spelled out to you much more clearly just walking around the neighborhood. And that's clearly what happened to him. The other thing that is very clear from everyone I talked to is that Moscone was a people person. In doing research for the book, I reviewed videos, and whatever videos I could find, of him like campaigning on the street. And there's a scene of him in the southern part of the city. He's campaigning in this video, and I talk about in the book, you see him speaking Italian, Spanish, and English. And just talking to very kind of, just whoever happens to walk down the street. At one point, he's walking out of a mechanic shop, and then he talks to some older guy who's kind of trying to get home, And I think he was not an angry guy. Like there are politicians that are motivated by anger on the left and the right. He wasn't a yeller in that sense. I think that drives some of this as well. That's a little bit where the empathy comes from. I mean, a lot of people say this deep commitment, but that's just restating the question. It's a complicated question. Where do any of us get our politics from? Some we get it from who we are, but we also get it from our experiences, and we also get it from how we're wired, right? I mean, we all know families where one brother or sister, loves Donald Trump and the other hates them, right? Where does that come from?
Right. It is not an easy question to answer for sure. But I do appreciate that your work on this was so comprehensive to give the reader as wide of a viewpoint with as much evidence, I guess,
Yeah.
to really consider that question. And I love when a book, is about a specific topic, but then it brings in some of these other like life questions that really make you start thinking about yourself and your own experiences. And I think this is one of those books that does that you do as you're reading, you stop and think, why do I believe the certain things that I do? Where does my political leanings come from? And relating to some of the things that he experienced or lack of. Not having exposure to other things, not ever hearing the other side of an argument or a belief system. That can also be something to make you stop and think of like, well, have I ever considered the other side of this situation? I only hear the things that reinforce what I already think, which I think is a big problem today because that's easy to do with social media, to only hear the side that you want to hear. So I loved that this book did make me stop and think and really consider a little bit more about myself and people around me, how we do develop and where we find those values and belief systems. So I thought that was a really cool kind of side thing to get out of this.
Thank you. It's really great I always love to hear what people take away because, here I've been in San Francisco now doing some book events, and a lot of people here, they just want to reminisce about, these are older people who just want to tell their George Moscone stories. And, there's more to the book than that. And I think you're right. But I would also add that one thing, first of all, I think that the experience of being, as he grew up, working class in a densely populated, diverse city, even, like I said, it was diverse, but in the kind of mid-century way, you're surrounded by different opinions. The kind of political chatter and other chatter just all around you everywhere. And you can't just follow some people on Twitter. You walk down the street, you go to the school, you already go to the basketball court. He didn't sit on the bench much like I did when I was playing baseball. But, you hear a lot of different things and you have to process that. And the other thing I would say is that finally became mayor. So he ran for mayor in 75. He was sworn in January of 1976 and was assassinated in November of 1978. I hope I'm not spoiling the ending, but I think if there's one thing about George Moscone people know, it's that he really struggled to turn his visions into governance. I don't think you could call it a success. He did some very important things, notably really diversifying the commissions and the boards, which are so important to this city's government. Interestingly, in his first 3 months in office, he spent most of his time trying to keep the baseball team from leaving, and he succeeded in keeping the Giants here. I think it's pretty true to say if it weren't for George Moscone, the Giants would have left in 1976. But he didn't bring about sweeping progressive change because he ran up against the reality of budgeting. It's not like today where the media has told a story about crime that isn't true because they want to empower kind of right-wing moneyed interests here. But at that time, people were legitimately very concerned about crime. And if he couldn't get crime under control and couldn't address the budget, and then Prop 13, which made budgeting impossible for cities in California in mid-78. So it's one of the lessons here, I think, from an urban politics perspective, is just how difficult governance is, even for a politically gifted, charismatic mayor who knew how to govern. He knew how to pass laws. He had as much experience as anybody you could want coming into that office, and still how difficult that is.
It's important to remember, too, that work gets carried on by other people, even if one person doesn't quite accomplish everything. Hopefully that's kind of started the ball rolling and keeps it going over time.
The tragedy in San Francisco is that it didn't, right? Mm-hmm. The tragedy in San Francisco is that he got assassinated, and then we have had, with the exception of, 1 4-year stint of Art Agnos, we've never had that progressive moment again. So one of the many unanswered questions, because I always think, both as a professor and as a writer, that the best books and lectures are the ones that raise more questions than they answer, because we don't really have any answers. But the major unanswered question is what would have happened had he not been killed, right? He probably gets reelected in a close race. 8 years of George Moscone, as opposed to the kind of pro-business liberal of Dianne Feinstein, and this city may look very different today. That we'll never know. But, one of the tragedies is that, there was, and I've talked to people about why, when he was killed in November of 78, he was preparing to run for re-election, but nobody runs as a progressive again until 1987. And both 79 and 83, well, in 79, Feinstein, who became mayor, was challenged from the right. And then in 83, she ran unopposed. And it was just this moment in the political evolution of the left here where Moscone, because he was from an earlier generation, had been around for a while, was able to win. But there was no one else ready to pick up that mantle. Harvey Milk was dead too by then. So it really set back progressive politics here dramatically. And to go back to where we started, part of the story as to why San Francisco has seen as more progressive than it is goes back to this moment when it really enters the culture between 67 and 78. You have the Summer of Love, and then you have the kind of rising LGBT movement. And that tells us, and then kind of all the kind of weirdness around the Summer of Love, everything from cults to health food, et cetera, which begins to tell a story about San Francisco. And at the same time, the moment the opportunity to make real progressive governance comes and goes in 3 years because Dan White assassinates George Moscone.
Well, and I hope that this gets people thinking about where the city and where candidates stand at the moment and where they want to go moving forward. And I know that there is so much more that we could talk about with this book, but we are out of time and we need to start wrapping up. I think we just scratched the surface, but hopefully that is enough to get people to be interested and go take a look for themselves and start reading and learning and making their own judgments and decisions about it. But before we wrap up, I do want to remind our listeners that the book is called 3 Years Our Mayor, George Moscone and the Making of Modern San Francisco by Lincoln Mitchell. And Lincoln, where can people find you and the book online?
The book you can find at all the usual places. If you live in the Bay Area, particularly the city of San Francisco, you can find it in most bookstores here. And if they don't have it, you should please ask them to order it. Most of them do, and I've been signing a few of them around town. But all the usual online places. You can get more if you, for whatever reason, want more of me. I'm on Blue Sky and on Twitter at Lincoln Mitchell. My Substack, Kibitzing with Lincoln, you can find that on Substack. I write there about both national politics, San Francisco politics, and then occasionally baseball. And my website is www.lincolnmitchell.com.
Thank you so much for sharing so much information and for doing such a thorough job researching this. It's really an interesting topic, and I hope people check it out.
Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation.